Podcast P is no more, or at the very least, Podcast P is on an indefinite hiatus. Recently, Paul George, on his last podcast, said that he is going to be stepping away from the show for quite a while to focus his body and mind on getting a championship for the Philadelphia 76ers. And there's a couple of reasons why this is hilarious, and there's a couple of reasons why this is stupid. So let's first open up with the stuff that's funny. Saying that you're quitting a podcast so that you can win an NBA championship is about the funniest thing I've ever heard. For Paul George, from his point of view, that podcast is an hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours out of his day once a week, which there is this thing that NBA fans have done historically, which is that they give players shit for having hobbies or doing anything publicly that isn't basketball. Now, if it's something like Luka doing hookah, if your habit off of the court is eating poorly or doing these things that make you worse on the court, at least theoretically, then I can understand why that would garner some criticism, even if I still don't even fully agree with it 9 times out of 10, at least the extent in which people get upset about these things. But, oh my God, does a podcast not matter for making, for like how much time it takes away from an NBA player? You physically cannot work 24/7 or 16/8 and the 8 hours is for sleep. Like, I understand that a lot of people, I just realized that 8 would imply there's 8 days of the week. I meant the hours. You have to have moments of leisure. You have to have moments of not really doing much of anything. And a podcast is a great way to do not much of anything because all you're really doing is talking. And for that reason, the suggestion that the podcast is there to get his body right is a little silly. It is also, of course, extremely funny to even remotely have any hint, any indication at all of the idea of winning a championship this year, given the current context of the Philadelphia 76ers. Yes, they can still theoretically make the play-in. I think if everything went right, they could actually somehow avoid it because the Eastern Conference is at a very weird stage of non-competitiveness. But all that said, they're not winning a fucking championship. If the Sixers won a championship this offseason, it is the single least likely championship going into the postseason that has ever happened, and it will never be topped. There will never be an example of a team that had its backs against the wall, that had the odds pitted against them more than that. So on that front, all of that is ridiculous. Where I do think the podcast does come into play for his mental health, well, is for his mental health. That does impact the on-the-court product. Paul has been public and open with his mental health struggles, and I appreciate when players do that. And because he's cognizant of it, he's trying to protect his mental health, which is what anybody should do. And if you take a look at the comment section of any Podcast P episode, it's brutal. Everybody is frying him the whole time. It's one thing to publicly sign a contract for $200 million and then immediately fall off, but it's another when you have your own social media platform where you are constantly getting berated for that very fact. Like, he does not even have this safe space to just talk about hoops with people. Like, in his ideal world, you know, these two things would not intersect, but we do not live in that world. We do not live in a world where people are capable of separating Paul George talking about basketball on his podcast from him being not as good as you would like at basketball in real life. They're really only very tangentially related, and that's the fullest extent of it, but it's enough to make a connection, and that's all people need to run with it. So the comments just being brutal, everybody constantly giving him shit for his show, like, I cannot emphasize enough. The reason Paul George has been bad this year is not because of his podcast. The reason Paul George has been bad this year is he's 34 and he's had a long history of injuries. I think we as NBA fans have grown to expect longevity rather than appreciate it when it happens. Now, obviously, George just signed this super huge contract, and with that amount of money comes a level of expectation. And I always kind of fall on a weird line with that, especially for this amount of money, where I understand why fans are upset. I understand why they don't, why they're giving him shit for this to some extent. But I also always just fall back to, blame Daryl Morey, blame the person who put that contract in front of him, because the Clippers made the very conscious decision not to do that. And no one else was really going to make the decision to do that. But the Sixers were at a point of desperation where they needed this Paul George thing to work out, so they were willing to fork over the amount of money that he was asking for. So at the end of the day, that's on the Sixers more than it's on Paul George, but it's very hard to separate that and not act like Paul George is literally the face of this bad contract, because he is the face of this bad contract. That's the positive thing that the behind-the-scenes people in any industry get the benefit of. Even if Daryl Morey is more forward-facing than a lot of other general managers, at the end of the day, people are going to put the criticism on the players before the organization 9 times out of 10. Not that there isn't criticism coming in the direction of the organization by any means, but I do think a large volume of it has been targeted directly at Paul in a way that's unfair. And again, the highlighting of the podcast, making the podcast the problem, is ridiculous, because the podcast isn't the problem. Never has been. But for the sake of Paul George's mental health, which very much does affect how you play the game of basketball, well, this would probably improve it. Not to mention, his views on his show is not very good. Frankly, pretty sad for what he used to get. So I think in the combination of him falling off as a basketball player, people have just kind of stopped watching his show because they're tired of hearing him yap while his on-the-court product is so shit. I understand why that would happen. I also think the show often does a poor job of advertising itself, just from the perspective of one content creator to another, I guess. He's obviously got a whole team behind him, but I regularly feel like the titles and the way they present things, the way they cut up their clips and stuff, is just a little basic, a little like, I feel like the show is very often trying to coast on Paul George just being this super strong personality. And while he's not lacking in charisma or having something interesting to say by any means, I also think he's very far from the top of my list of NBA players that I care to hear from. I only really would watch his show if he had a good guest. So I understand why the show has fallen off, and that also is bad for your mental health. I can tell you that as a content creator as well. Anytime my views have been down, I have been in a bad mood and felt like shit, and anytime they have been high, I felt great. It is very much determined by a lot of my own mental health issues, but Paul George has his own as well, and unfortunately, I don't think the human brain is built to handle what social media does to you. But there just simply will not be anything funnier than, there can't be anything funnier than saying I'm quitting my podcast to win an NBA championship. That is so fucking funny. I'm not laughing because it's that level of funny that it's just, you feel it in your heart and you can leave it at that. That is so fucking funny that he quit the podcast to win a championship. I've talked about the Sixers a little bit in my Paul George video towards the end, just like, is there any hope to recover this? They're going to go into next season before they do anything. They're not trading Joel Embiid this offseason. I think they're going to try and run it back one more time because his trade value is as low as it could possibly fucking be right now. But yeah, Sixers situation still a nightmare, but at least this is funny. At least we have this. If you're a Sixers fan, you don't have anything, but at this point, you should be used to that. At least you guys won a Super Bowl. All right, that's it. Bye.